The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor by midnightwolf2192, my personal redo. Chapter 8, Steve. When Steve first met Peter, he didn't meet Peter. He met Spider-Man. During that meeting, he threw an airport boarding tunnel on the hero, so it probably wasn't the most stellar first impression. The second time Steve met Spider-Man was during an incident in Times Square. The Avengers had been called to intervene when giant lizards began emerging from the sewers.
"Clint, have you found out where these things are coming from?" Steve called down the comms as he slammed his shield into another lizard.
The team had been fighting for 2 hours now, but they never seemed to stop.
"Negative, Cap. Just from the sewers."
Clint's reply was strained, and from where Cap was, he could see the man firing arrow after arrow at high speed. "We need to find their central exit point and close it." Nat's voice was also strained as she spoke.
"I think I can help there."
A new voice came over the comms, and the team all turned their heads as Spider-Man grabbed one lizard and webbed another to the ground.
"What have you got for us?"
Tony asked, and Steve tried to keep his composure. Ever since he and the others had returned, Tony had refused to even look at him, let alone speak. When he had been forced to communicate, Tony's words were short and sharp, and so icy that Steve could feel the shivers running down his spine. But with this person, Tony almost sounded warm and fond. Tony landed off to Steve's left, near where Spider-Man had come to a stop. "I found where they're coming from, and I know who is doing this," Spider-Man said as he and Tony dodged one of the lizards.
"Can you take us there?"
Steve asked, and Spider-Man looked over at him. Steve felt overly scrutinized as the other hero looked him up and down before turning his gaze back to Tony. "The man behind this is Dr. Kurt Connors, former Oscorp scientist," Spider-Man continued as if he hadn't heard Steve. "Sources say he was fired from Oscorp 3 months ago after some ethical issues were raised during his research."
"Do you know where these things are coming from?"
Rhodey asked, and Spider-Man nodded. "They're all emerging from a central junction about 4 blocks over. These lizards here on the ground are the last ones," Spider-Man replied, and Tony turned sharply to him.
"And how do you know that?"
Tony demanded, and the other superhero shrugged. As Tony continued to stare him down, Steve watched as the figure shrunk back slightly. "I may have just come from there. I may or may not have just had a teensy, tiny altercation with Dr. Connors. And he may or may not have been in full lizard form when this happened," Spider-Man said, and Steve watched as Tony's faceplate flew up.
"So you're telling me that you took on a genetically enhanced lizard by yourself, and you didn't think to call for backup?"
Tony demanded, and Spider-Man's head dropped.
"See these greys? You're the main cause of them. Fry, run a scan on Spider-Brat."
Steve couldn't hear the AI's response, but he watched as Spider-Man's body language changed. Steve couldn't tell much about what the other person was feeling due to the mask, but he could see that his body language had begun to resemble that of an exasperated child. Tony ignored the protests and continued to have Friday check him over.
"So we just have to manage these ones? What about this Dr. Connors?"
Steve asked, drawing the attention of the other 2 men. "Contained," Spider-Man said firmly, almost coldly, and Steve frowned. Surely the kid, he was young during the Germany fight, that much Steve knew for sure, couldn't still be mad about the boarding tunnel. "I webbed him up, and once the antidote spreads through his system, the NYPD will take him into custody."
"All right, Spider-Brat. Friday says you have some minor injuries, but your healing is taking care of that."
Tony interrupted, and Spider-Man turned back to the other man.
"Head straight for the tower. I'll meet you back in my lab for a debrief. My intern will probably be there, so if that's the case, don't scare him. He can be quite jumpy."
"Gotcha, boss," Spider-Man replied cheekily. He gave a quick 2-fingered salute before firing a web and swinging away. Steve turned to ask Tony about the other hero, but before he could open his mouth, Tony's faceplate dropped back down and the man shot back into the sky. When the team had returned to the tower, Tony told Rhodey to take notes for him in the debrief before he disappeared down to his private lab. And, once again, Steve could only feel an immense guilt as Tony disappeared from view. Steve first met Peter as a hyperactive blur that rushed into the common room and had thrown a folder at his best friend. Before Steve could question the kid, Bucky jumped out of his seat and pulled the kid into a tight hug. Bucky? Steve asked after a few minutes. Bucky pulled away from the teen, and Steve noticed he was wiping a few tears from his eyes. The kid looked over at him, and Steve could have sworn he saw a flash of anger cross the kid's eyes.
Who's this? Right, Stevie, this is Peter. Peter, this is my best bud Steve. Peter here is Stark's intern, Bucky explained, and the kid nodded at Steve. His face, however, soon became bright red as Bucky continued to speak. He is insanely smart. He has just completely redesigned my arm, and according to these notes, will soon have an upgrade for me.
Wow, was all Steve could say. The boy continued to look down at the floor, but Steve could tell he was proud of himself.
That's a truly kind thing for you to do, son. You must be brilliant.
I'm just average, Mr. Captain America PSA Rogers, sir, Peter replied, and while Steve raised an eyebrow at the name, Bucky blew him away with a loud bark of laughter that emerged from him.
Wait!
Bucky asked between deep, hearty laughs.
PSA? What the hell is that?
Oh, you don't know? Peter asked, and Steve watched as the boy raised his head. There was an almost malicious twinkle in his eye as he looked up at Bucky.
Oh, Lord, I can't believe this,
Steve said. He put his coffee down and tablet on the table, and he felt himself blush scarlet.
Do they still show those?
Of course they do, Peter replied, his voice being drowned out slightly by Bucky's laughter. Peter then turned to the former assassin and smirked. Want to see? Ignoring Steve's protests, Peter pulled Bucky into the living room and asked Friday to turn the TV on. Steve followed them slowly and could only watch in horror as Friday pulled up a playlist of all his Rappin' with Cap videos. After the first one, a hysterical Bucky sent a message to Natasha and told her to get to the common room ASAP. The spy in question walked into the room, and it was only because of years of knowing her that Steve realized she was prepared for a hostile threat. She obviously hadn't been prepared to see Bucky and a teenager sitting on the lounge, while Steve sat in an armchair blushing bright red.
Nat, this is...
Steve started to say, but Peter jumped to his feet and interrupted the statement. Bucky stopped laughing, and both men stood stunned as the teenager walked over to Nat and wrapped his arms around her waist. What surprised them even more was that Nat didn't pull out a knife. Instead, she leaned down and kissed the teen on the head. Hey, Pete, Nat said as the two broke apart. So, why does Cap resemble a tomato? What have I missed? As Nat and Peter climbed back onto the lounge and the torturous video started again, Steve could almost pretend things were back to normal. He could almost imagine Tony was with them and was teasing him just as much as the others. 20 minutes later, Friday's voice echoed throughout the floor, causing the group to jump. Forgive me for interrupting, Friday said. Boss is requesting the presence of the whiz kid. He says,
if you want to show off, surely you're done by now.
Peter jumped to his feet, and after grabbing his folder and saying goodbye to the adults, bolted out of the room and into the elevator. Steve watched the excitable teenager go with a fond smile. Another 3 weeks passed before Peter and Steve met again. This time Steve was just coming back from a run and was riding in the elevator when a flustered-looking Peter entered from one of the lab floors. The teen hadn't noticed the soldier, his head buried in a textbook. Mr. Stark's floor, please, Fry, Peter mumbled, but the elevator didn't move. Peter looked up in confusion and finally noticed Steve. Oh, Mr. Captain America, sir. I'm sorry.
Please, call me Steve,
Steve said, and the boy blushed. Fry, why aren't we moving? Friday asked after a minute, and Steve looked at the ceiling while awaiting the AI's response. Mr. Rogers does not have access to Boss's floor. Do you want me to take him back to his floor first? Friday asked, and Steve tried not to wince. Many things had surprised him in this technological age, but an AI with emotions still scared and confused him at times. Oh no, that's fine, Peter replied. Override WizKid. Just drop me off and I'll jump out. The elevator began to move and Peter's head turned to his textbook. Steve watched the teen for another minute before focusing back on the door. They had only gone a few floors when an explosion rocked the tower. Without thought, Steve grabbed Peter and shielded the teen with his larger body. Steve heard Peter let out a soft whine as the elevator dropped a few floors, before the emergency brakes locked in.
"Are you all right?"
Steve asked once the elevator had stopped moving. He leant back to look the teen over, and noticed his breath was coming in short, sharp pants. The teen was clutching his head, and Steve knew that he was in the grips of a panic attack.
"Peter, I need you to focus on my voice."
"No, please, let me out. Help." Peter's voice was soft, but Steve's enhanced hearing could make out the words.
"Peter, I don't know what you're seeing, but whatever it is, it's not there,"
Steve said softly but firmly. He took the boy's hand in his and pressed it to his chest. Steve then began to take exaggerated breaths.
"Come on, son. You need to match my breathing. You're going to pass out otherwise."
"Come, breathe," Peter murmured, and Steve squeezed his hand.
"Yes, you can, son,"
Steve replied. He spoke slightly louder than before, hoping that the volume would help break through the kid's panic.
"You can breathe. There is nothing stopping you but yourself."
It took another few minutes of exaggerated breathing and coaxing for Peter's breathing to return to normal. When that happened, he looked up at Steve with tear-filled eyes and flushed cheeks. "I'm really sorry you had to see that," Peter murmured. He moved from his knees to sit with his back against the wall. Steve moved beside him and made sure to keep their shoulders contacting, so that Peter would still have something to ground him.
"There's nothing to be sorry for,"
Steve commented.
"We all get panic attacks sometimes. Bucky's are the worst, so Sam has taught us all how to manage them."
"I'm not a huge fan of tight spaces," Peter said, and Steve nodded comfortingly. "And I nearly lost my friends in an explosion similar to what happened here. I guess it just brought some things up." Steve nodded comfortingly and lifted his arm. Peter took the invitation and pressed into the soldier's side.
"Not to worry. Tony will have us out of here in no time,"
Steve said, and Peter nodded. Steve leant over and picked up the dropped textbooks.
"So, what are you learning about?"
It's a little embarrassing, but World War II. And you, I guess," Peter replied with a blush. "I have a history test in a few days, and while I'm doing well in the course, I do sometimes struggle with the exams."
"How about you tell me what your textbook says?" Steve said, and Peter looked up at him. "I mean, I missed a fair bit, but I could always help out with what I remember."
For the next 20 minutes, Peter recited the information from the textbook, and Steve occasionally piped in with corrections or clarifications. "You know, I hated you at first," Peter admitted softly. Steve had just finished explaining D-Day to Peter when the teen spoke. Peter looked up at Steve with his large brown eyes, and Steve nodded for him to continue. "I really hated you, especially when you came back. I really wanted to punch you or throw you off the roof." Steve kept his mouth shut and let the teen speak his piece. Steve assumed that this was something that had been brewing for a while now. "You hurt Mr. Stark," Peter said, his tone becoming strangled and angry. "You slammed the shield into his chest and left him in the bunker in Siberia. I hated you for that. Mr. Stark doesn't know that I know. Friday showed me the footage. I asked why he was so cold towards you, beyond just what the Civil War had done, and Friday told me it would be best if I saw it."
"Peter, I am so sorry,"
Steve said, but Peter shook his head. "I hated you so much for coming back. You hurt him. I almost lost him before I even really got to know him," Peter continued. "I hated that you tried to waltz back into his life when you nearly took it from him. I hated that you hid important things from him, especially once I learned how close he was to his mum. I think a part of me still wants to hate you."
"But,"
Steve prompted hopefully. "But there is a bigger part of me that can't," Peter said softly. I had 3 role models growing up. My Uncle Ben, Mr. Stark, and you. You were the total underdog, and for a skinny kid with asthma, you were the ideal. I wanted to grow up strong and brave like you. I remember watching the Avengers fight the Chitauri, and I remember praying that both you and Mr. Stark would be okay. That part, the small, idealistic child, loves you.
Wow, son.
Steve had no other words. He had heard songs of praise dedicated to him before, but none with such passion. I have a really good sixth sense, Peter said. Think anxiety on super soldier serum. It can tell me pretty much with 100% accuracy whether a situation is safe or whether or not a person is good. With you, it only flared up at the beginning, and that was because I was mad. But now I don't feel it around you.
Peter, I will never be able to fully articulate how sorry I am,
Steve replied once Peter grew silent.
I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was only doing what was right for me. I realise that now. There were so many factors I didn't consider. I was blinded by my need to help, and by my need to protect Bucky. I can see now how my views were jaded.
I used to think that superheroes were infallible, that you were unable to make a bad choice, Peter said, and Steve let out a pained laugh.
Yeah, I think I thought that too. That was the voice of the Steve who enlisted in the army and joined the super soldier program. Back then, things made sense. Things were more black and white, whereas now, there are so many grey areas to navigate.
Steve continued.
After spending time in Wakanda, I realise now that the world can't simply be black and white. I realise now that I was wrong.
Yes, you were, Peter said, but so was Mr. Stark. Both of you were wrong, and both of you were failing to take the other's concerns or personal histories into consideration.
Do you think Tony will agree to see me? Steve asked. I want to talk things out with him. I want us to try and be friends again. How about we get the two of you out of here, and then Capsicle and I can have coffee?
A new voice joined the conversation, and both Steve and Peter jumped. Tony had his head and upper body sticking through the opened elevator emergency hatch above them. It appeared that the elevator had stopped just below one of the floors.
Sorry it took us so long. Not a problem. But can we get out of here, though?
Steve asked. He looked down at Peter with a smile.
This young man has a history exam to study for. My reputation as a historical source depends on it.
Peter rolled his eyes as both he and Steve stood. Peter grabbed his history book and climbed up onto Steve's clasped hands when prompted. Tony helped the teen crawl out of the elevator and handed him off to Happy. Tony then stuck his head back into the elevator.
Come on, Capsicle. You owe me a coffee and a chat,
Tony said. Steve took the outstretched hand and, with Tony's help, climbed out of the elevator. Apparently, some scientists had been working on a new chemical compound when they had mixed in the wrong chemicals. The resulting explosion had knocked out 3 labs from commission, and 3 of the 5 elevators had also been affected. Friday's systems had been hazy in those areas, and it wasn't until an hour after the explosion that Friday was rebooted. 3 hours after the explosion, Steve was hesitatingly walking out of the stairwell. One elevator trip was enough for today, onto Tony's private floor. He knocked on the door, and the man in question opened it after a moment.
Come in, Capsicle,
Steve said. He led the soldier into the kitchen, and Steve noticed 2 cups of coffee waiting on the bench.
Still like it black with one?
Yeah, nothing's changed, Steve said. He took the cup that Tony handed him, and was surprised that Tony still remembered how he took his coffee.
Come on. We should be comfortable for this conversation,
Tony said. The 2 men walked into the living room and sat down on the couches.
So, I watched the footage from the elevator. I thought Friday was down,
Steve commented, and Tony waved his hand.
She was, but only her real-time response system was affected in the elevators. Her backup systems allowed her to still record in there,
Tony explained.
I feel like I should apologise for Peter, but I can't. Nor do I want to.
Don't.
He was looking out for you, and speaking the truth.
Steve replied.
He was doing what I should have done, and looked it out for you. And I should have done a lot of things differently too,
Tony agreed.
Tony, I am eternally sorry that I kept the truth about Howard and Maria from you. Despite wanting to protect Bucky, I shouldn't have kept that from you.
Steve said.
You're one of my closest friends. You deserved so much better from me. And you deserved more from me,
Tony replied.
It's taken me a long time to admit my failings. One of those being that I am beyond stubborn when I think I'm right. Peter and Pepper are the ones who have made that possible for me to see that. Tony, you have a great kid,
Steve said, and a proud smile crossed Tony's face.
I wish I could claim him.
Tony's voice was full of affection as he spoke.
He has shown me a different side of the world. One that isn't so dark and cynical. He's a pain in the ass, but I wouldn't want him any other way.
As Tony and Steve spoke, the footage was being viewed in real time by Pepper, Happy and Rhodey. The three of them had heard from Peter what Tony was planning, and while they wanted to intervene, they knew it was something that needed to happen. Only Peter could do this, Pepper whispered as she watched the scene in front of her.
Next time there is a villain, we just sick Peter on them. They'll be domesticated in a heartbeat,
Rhodey teased, but both Happy and Pepper nodded. The trio continued to watch the reunion until both men finished their coffees. The reunion ended with a firm handshake and a pat on the back. The next morning, Natasha walked into Tony's lab and noticed another checkmark against the Avengers, and she realized that maybe things could start getting back to some semblance of normal. Well, as normal as a tower full of superheroes could be. Peter Factor 8, Avengers 0. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Okay, I've been meaning to do this one for a while. Oh boy, yeah, Steve getting a bit of a wake-up call. Bucky's reactions to the PSA are hilarious. And him and Bucky being like, wait, what the heck? When Natasha gives Peter a kiss on the head. That's sweet. But of course, that confrontation. Because sometimes you have to hear something from the mouth of someone innocent, don't you? In order for it to fully sink in what is happening. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.